Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. Well, Wayne Stender has left us, much to our sorrow and disappointment, but we're happy for him and his new endeavors and all that he's doing with his family and his local community. But we're working on a new phase of this weekly Further Upstream discussion. We're excited about it. But as we do that, I have invited my friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Padgett, who's the Colson Center theologian-in-residence, to join me to discuss my most recent episode. And I'm excited for this kind of different and new sort of conversation. So Tim, welcome back to Upstream. It is really good to have you.
Thanks. I was glad to do this with Wayne just a couple of weeks ago. And as you say, it's sad to see him go, and we're definitely feeling the lack of it, but we're looking forward to building on what he has started there with this.
Yeah, there's a lot to do. And this segment has always been sort of a loose and flexible segment. We have talked about the recent episode of Upstream, where we go through the discussion that I had with whatever guest it happens to be in our hour-long format, and then just ask some additional questions. And I think Wayne's approach was to sort of anticipate some of the questions that listeners might have that I didn't think of and that he was able to think of. But obviously, you're in a different kind of spot. You come from a different perspective. You have a different academic background and so forth. So I want to make this much more of a two-way sort of thing now, where you've got a lot of questions, a long list of them, in fact, and a lot of insights I think could be very helpful. So this recent conversation, of course, was my discussion with Ryan Anderson and Alexandra DeSanctis, who are co-authors of the new book, Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. And of course, we recorded this within one day of the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs coming down. And so we hedged a little bit, but we had kind of this understanding of what was going to happen. And I think they had an understanding writing the book, prediction of what was going to happen. And then, of course, when the decision was leaked a couple of months ago, that was reinforced. So here we are in exactly the scenario that we have hoped and prayed for, where abortion is no longer a federally recognized constitutional right. Roe v. Wade and Casey have been struck down. So that leaves us with a lot of different questions, and questions that play into and emerge out of the discussion that I had with Ryan and Alexandra. So I want to ask you this first, Tim. Do you have any initial thoughts about my conversation with them and about their book and about where we're headed in the future on the abortion issue?
Well, absolutely. I have read the book, and I thought it was an outstanding book. It's just very clear, concise, non-inflammatory way to approach an issue, which is very often very inflammatory. It's a very contentious issue. They just laid out the facts. And I thought that your conversation with them reflected what they had already said and what they had already dealt with, but it also built on that. There are a few nuances, observations that you had made or things that they brought out that, at least I don't remember going through the book. I don't remember them mentioning it. It was just nice to have that flesh out. And as far as where things are, I mean, goodness, like you say, we are at the place where we have always wanted to be. I remember I was, as a kid, I would go in what they called a pastor's protest. I was in Nashville where I grew up, and we all the past once a year, there'd be a march. And I was a little kid doing this in the early 80s, and it had only been 10 years or whatever since Roe v. Wade. Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I did a research project dealing with Christianity Today. And I remember reading an article from 1993, the 20th anniversary. And they were talking about, it's been 20 years. How are things coming? How is it we haven't made any progress? And that was 30 years ago or 29 years ago or whatever. And so to finally reach that moment, there is an element, I think, for a lot of pro-lifers where, it's like when you play with a dog. He's trying to grab a toy, tries to grab it, and then you finally let him have it. And then he looks up at you like, what do I do now? And I think that there's, for a lot of us, kind of on this cosmic cultural scale, we've gotten what we've been trying to get, and now what? And I think that really is the big question that a lot of us have. And I think that the conversation that you had and the book that they wrote, I think it does begin to point us the way forward.
That's exactly right. One of the points that was been obvious to me from the moment that it became apparent there was a possibility that Roe v. Wade would be overturned is that we actually, in moving forward, have to look backwards. We have to look back to the initial arguments, the rationale, the philosophical assumptions, and the moral ideas, the bad ideas that went into legalizing abortion. And the reason is very simple, because we're going to have 50 different battles over this now in the states and the laboratories of democracy, if you will. And in many ways, this is, it's kind of a reset to 1973, but it's also a reset to a state of affairs on this issue that's more in line with the rest of the developed world. And this is one of those interesting points about abortion in the United States that you never really hear. Most of Europe, Western Europe at least, most of the rest of the developed world, with a few very rare exceptions, dealt with the abortion issue legislatively. And in doing so, they placed some very, boundaries that I would not endorse as a pro-life individual, but I understand are popular in the public. And so those boundaries are typically things like 15-week bans. So most of Europe, in most of Europe, the boundary for abortion is between 12 and 15 weeks. After that, you only get to have an abortion if there's like an extreme extenuating circumstance or something. In the United States, bans at 15 weeks were repeatedly and continually struck down by the court system as violating the precedent in Roe v. Wade and considered unconstitutional. So we had this, instead of solving the problem legislatively, like other countries, we had this weird setup where the Supreme Court came in, swooped right in and imposed this as a national constitutional right that could not be interfered with legislatively. And so they short-circuited the issue. They took it completely out of the democratic process. Now that has been restored. But what that means is that arguments in a legislative setting are now going to be very, very crucial. And those include arguments not only about the policy effects of restrictions on abortion or the supposed benefits of abortion, but the moral issues involved. Because, as we've pointed out frequently at the Colson Center, all legislation is really rooted in morality, right? There's no such thing as not legislating morality. Every law at bottom has some moral principle operating. Even speed limits, they're arbitrary in a sense, but the moral principle behind those is that you don't want to endanger other people's lives by being reckless. And the same thing is true in laws about murder and child abuse and so forth. And this is something that kind of overlaps with both of those. And so we as pro-lifers have to rehearse some of these really important arguments and be ready to make the case, not only in legislatures, but in the public, because ultimately the public is the root of the legislatures, right? They're the ones who elect them. And so I want to ask you this. What do you think are the most important classes of arguments moving forward that we need to be ready for, especially based on the conversation that I had with Ryan and Alexandra? Because as I see it, there's like 3 or 4 distinct classes of arguments for and against abortion.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is the moral argument. I mean, people might say that there's no absolute standard for morality, but all you have to do is listen to the pro-abortion side for 5 minutes and you realize this is for them fundamentally a moral issue, that this is the right thing to do and it's wrong. And I think that one of the arguments that I think the strongest one is the bodily autonomy issue. That's probably the one that we have to deal with the most. Because when you look back in history, you think back like 1973, when Roe v. Wade was first promulgated. Think of imaging technology. Think of understanding of DNA. I mean, you watch crime shows from the 80s. They don't talk about DNA, whereas now DNA is very clear. We're very familiar with it. When you talk about this stuff, you can look at the embryo, you can look at the fetus, you could look at this unborn child and say this is a different person. It is someone with a different DNA makeup. Very clearly. And then again, just simply the imaging technologies that you have for sonograms and 3D sonograms and all these sorts of things. And the fact that you can do surgeries on the unborn. As that has progressed, the idea of, the clump of cells argument has just gone kind of into the background. It still shows up. As you know, Shane, part of my job is sometimes to monitor some of the comments that come in to the Colson Center. That's a job that I think waiting tables for 20 years really prepared me for, because sometimes people say some things and you just need to smile sweetly back at them. But in that, we still do hear that every once in a while. But just increasingly, what is it people say? It's my body, my choice. They're not even my body, my choice. It's like a boy, a girl, abortion, talking about all these sort of, they sound so awful to us, and they relish in the shock value, I think, of it. Speaking of it as a parasite, and the violinist argument you guys discussed, it's ultimately they moved beyond. This is another human. This is not a human being. This is just part of the woman's body. I mean, I think that is the most common one. As I saw several of my friends ostensibly Christian friends. And I don't just mean like you and I are both from the South, and you know what the South is like with Christianity. It's the thing you go to church on, the Creasters. But people who are very serious about their faith, and they talk about how they're against forced birth. And as I think DeSanctis mentioned, that's a very new argument. I think that's probably the one that we have to deal with the most, that it is ultimately about autonomy. That this is why do women need to have abortions? So they can fulfill the careers they want to have. Why should they be able to abort the baby? Because they need to have they don't want to be tied down. It's all about my autonomy. And it's a very appealing argument to Americans. So I think it resonates well with us. And I think that's one we're going to have to face more than both. I mean, as one of them said in the interview, the science is on our side. They have to go to philosophy, strangely enough. They have to go to this faith, this religious thing.
Well, that's the only argument for abortion that I've seen that actually seems willing to bite the bullet and say, yes, the unborn is a distinct human being, right? But it doesn't matter that it's a distinct human being because bodily autonomy, a woman has the right to get rid of it in order to pursue her individual aims and assert her rights and freedoms over her own body. Like, she can't be held a prisoner by her offspring. The main reply, it seems like, obviously, to that is, well, were you really taken prisoner, or is this the result of a choice that you made? And the immediate obvious response is, well, what about rape and incest and so forth? And I like John Stonestreet's kind of strategy on that, where he says, okay, well, set those aside for the moment. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say that we'll allow abortions in the cases of rape and incest, which account for a very tiny percentage of pregnancies that end in abortion. What about the rest of them? What about the ones where it's a voluntary elective abortion in a pregnancy that was the result of a consensual sexual relationship? What about those? You can't say in those cases that someone has been taken prisoner against their will, because you did the thing that makes babies.
Right. Yeah.
If you don't even have to have gone through high school biology class, you just have to have seen the animal kingdom. You know what this does. Okay. And yet you still engaged in the activity, which cannot be called being taken victim, as in the Judith Jarvis Thompson violinist analogy.
It's like, I'm a coffee lover. And if I have coffee at 10 o'clock,
you are.
Yes. If I have my normal thing of coffee that I normally have at 5 in the morning, if I have that at 5 at night or 11 at night, I am going to be awake. I have chosen this. I cannot then complain that, I'm awake now at 2 in the morning or something like that. And I think that there's this fideism to much of this argument. As John Stonestreet likes to say, that Gnosticism that is so prominent in our culture, that there's this rejection of physicality, that I should be able to do what I do. Or Anderson talked about it a lot, about this rejection of our body as being part of who we are. And I think that's just a strange element, because here we are, we're the religious crowd, right? We're the ones who talk about principles and philosophies and moralities that are bigger than cultures, bigger than customs and all that kind of stuff. And we're the ones who are saying the physicality matters. And I actually, this is one of the notes I had here. It's like, I every time I see you post something on Facebook, every other time it's some wonderful nature thing that you've done. You're swimming with alligators or with sharks or some other insane thing that you guys in Florida do. Seeing those things, you're the science guy in the sense, and you know about animal life. What is your reaction when you hear people basically denying this fundamental element of the animal kingdom, of all the phylum and orders and all that kind of stuff? This is a fundamental part of being a biological entity on this planet, at least, that there's male and there's female, that there's consequences of things, this rejection of physicality.
That's the core of it. And we really got to this in our discussion about the book. The upstream idea that led to abortion is really the divorce between sex, marriage, and procreation, right? Sex becomes this mode of self-expression and recreation that is no longer for procreation. It is no longer for the unitive bond of a marriage. It has no purpose anymore. It becomes this thing floating out in the ether that we can just take advantage of and repurpose for whatever we desire. And I don't think that this state of affairs would have been possible were it not for the widespread acceptance and use of birth control. And this is an argument that Mark Regnerus has made for years in his sort of analysis of the economics of sex. It's a crass way of putting it, but the basic idea is that is really obvious and intuitive biologically, that men pay a low price for sex. Women pay a very high price for sex. Men's role in reproduction from a physical standpoint is measured in minutes. Women's role in reproduction from a physical standpoint is measured in years, even decades, not just months. And so it behooves a woman biologically to be very, very choosy with who she chooses to reproduce with, because that's going to be a lifelong sort of commitment for her, or at least decades long, raising that child. And the natural state of things is that therefore women are the gatekeepers of sex, women are highly restrictive of sex, and they require something of men in return socially, which is commitment. The commitment to be there, to provide during her pregnancy, right? Rare is the woman who can provide for herself through her pregnancy and having a new child. That's why she needs someone to provide for her. And all of cultures, all of civilization, through all of history have provided for that need through some sort of marriage arrangement, through some sort of arrangement where the woman who has the child is provided for by a contractual or covenantal bond into which she entered with a man in exchange, in a very crude sense, in exchange for sex. Well, birth control changed all that, because now women no longer necessarily pay such a high price for sex, at least not physically, at least not biologically, right? Women can now, in theory, behave like promiscuous men and can go out and have sex with very little consequence. And that changed the market dynamics. But not only that, it changed the way we think about it as well. And I really think, and that this is not original to me. This is not original to you. We're just repeating what we've read from very astute thinkers, who have recognized this pattern. But it's changed our psychology. We think of sex now in a way that would seem nonsensical to prior generations. So the idea that we can't engage in this activity in a consequence-free way, and we can't have this ultimate backup plan in case the birth control fails, right? To preserve our autonomy by killing the offspring. We chafe against that because we've accepted a different view of sexual intimacy, in which it is only recreational, only self-expressive, only a way to show the world our identity, instead of the core of this relationship that results in family and perpetuates society and is extremely costly for women. And so if we look at that change in assumptions, a lot of pieces start falling into place. A lot of things start to make sense. And you begin to see the source of some of the moral outrage on the other side. I would say immoral outrage, but the sense that you are taking our lives away from us. You're enslaving us. You see these Handmaid's Tale costumes everywhere, these protests. Well, you're making sex slaves out of us. Nobody's enslaving women to be sex slave breeding machines. Nobody's doing that. That is not a goal of the pro-life movement. But it's seen that way because by getting rid of the ultimate backstop on recreational self-expressive sex, we're saying it now has consequences. Even though we haven't, outlawed birth control or something, we don't have a Catholic monarchy in this country. Nevertheless, there is potentially more consequences now. And that bugs people because of that assumption.
Yeah, I think that one of the most telling things that kind of proves what you're saying there, those of us who are more on the conservative end of things, about pro-life about this, and believe in the sanctity of marriage, we've been laughing because how many times in the last week, 2 weeks, have people discovered marriage, as they say, when they just keep coming and saying, well, if a woman can't get rid of the pregnancy, then a man should have to be on the hook for his life. And we're like, that's what we've been saying for thousands of years. That's precisely what we want to happen. And so you have that element that they immediately recognize almost innately that this is what should be. And we're like, yes, that's what we want. We want the men to be responsible. There was a historical thing back in the 19th century, that not only was slavery obviously horrific for the African Americans, for those who were enslaved, the sexual abuse, the beatings, and just a simple lack of freedom, but it was several people in the 19th century noted that slavery was bad also for the enslavers, for the whites across the South, because it degraded them. It made them worse people. And so I think one thing that I think that Anderson DeSanctis brought up really well is the way that abortion, on the one hand, demeans women, because it makes them, as they said, the de facto, the default setting for humanity is now male. Someone who is not impacted by birth rates, someone who does not have to take years off of labor, that can continue to work and be a profitable member of society and not have to take off that time to have that child. That the default is the male. So not only does some of the key things that make women not men are stripped away, but it does harm to the men. Now, obviously, the men are made worse. It's men are turned into frat boys. You think about the stereotypical frat boy. What does he want? He wants to be able to have anonymous sex with multiple women with absolutely no consequences.
Usually, women in a state of significant intoxication.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Makes women into sex objects and gives men. I mean, this is when you talk about this, when you think about contraception in this sense, I'm not opposed to contraception as a philosophical principle, but in this, the abuse that can happen there, and that with abortion, when it is used in that way, it gives men what they have always wanted: consequence-free sexual pleasure. There is only the joy. That is toxic masculinity, easy for me to say, incarnate. It doesn't simply enable, it actually encourages that kind of attitude.
Yeah, this is one of the key insights of Regnerus's work, and then just a lot of good pro-life apologetics over the years, and Christian criticism of things like even the transgender movement. There's a pattern that begins to emerge in the whole movement for women's empowerment and women's rights in the later stages of feminism, where you begin to notice, hey, this is all supposed to be for women's benefit, but women are getting the short end of the stick on all of these fronts. Women are consuming record levels of antidepressants, for one thing. Women say they're less happy than they've ever been before. The surveys are all really clear on that. Women are coupled less often, are divorced and broken up with more often, feel degraded most often, and now can't even have their own sports leagues because men are breaking into those and setting new records and so forth. And now women are expected, as you said, to live along the sort of template or life script of a man, with the sort of low consequence sex, the career centric mindset. If you have any ambitions for being a spouse or mother, well, that's lesser, and you're cheating yourself and wasting your potential and so forth. And so this thing that is unique to women, that a huge part of their biology is geared toward universally, is now just supposed to be ignored. And as DeSanctis and Anderson say in the book, if you step back and look at the pattern, it's that men are now the template for everything. Women are expected to become men. So much for feminism. It just hasn't worked out in their favor.
I used this example in a webinar I did recently, but if you go to a regular bookstore and you see the section for little girls, what are the attributes that are advertised for these little girls to emulate? Power, defiance, fierceness, challenge. These are what's
warriors,
traditionally warriors. Yes, none of the thing of empathy. That is not seen as a goal. The traditionally feminine values, things that are to be praised, qualities of human nature that generally are attributed to women being better at. These good qualities are denigrated. They're less than. Caring for others, self-sacrifice. These are good qualities that we all should exemplify in some way, but those things are denigrated. And there is kind of an irony of all that.
Gabby and I tried to watch last night. We tried to watch this Netflix original movie with Millie Bobby Brown, who is, of course, 11 in Stranger Things. And she plays Nola Holmes. And that's the name of it, Nola Holmes. It's the movie. And she's like the little sister of Sherlock Holmes, who's played by Henry Cavill, aka Superman. So, the casting is great. Production value is fantastic. It looks amazing. The aesthetic is beautiful. But it's just like, we couldn't even watch the whole thing because it got so preachy in exactly the terms that you're describing here. In fact, there's Helena Bonham Carter plays Mrs. Holmes, their mother, the mother of the three siblings, one of whom is Sherlock. And it portrays her as raising her daughter in a way that openly mocks anything that you could consider feminine in the Victorian era. It's like, none of those are goals you should have. You should have the goals that would be stereotypically masculine. And so it shows her mom teaching her to do hand-in-hand combat. and and do these very stereotypically masculine pursuits, using weapons and so forth. And it's just like, now you're really educated because you've learned how to be a man. Now you're really educated. Like
a segue from what you said there about Victorian women, and another 19th century thing with Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And many people, including President Lincoln, attribute that book with, on the positive side, awakening the minds of many in the North to what was going on in the South. Negatively, there's the anecdote, I don't know if it's true or not, but that one time President Lincoln met Stowe and said, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." With that, it wasn't a factual thing. It was a novel. It was the imagination. And so I guess I want to ask, because you and I both love fantasy sorts of things and stories and all that kind of beautiful stuff. What is the role for us in using the imagination and using narrative and using not a list of facts and figures? I mean, the stuff about the science is great and absolutely necessary. But how can we in the pro-life movement help to change the story, to change the narrative, to help people to see beyond these very rigid talking points that they're stuck in?
That's a really good question, Tim. The book has sort of a bullet point list of suggested next steps or mission objectives at the end, and a significant number of them are about engaging culture and capturing the imagination, because, of course, the last chapter is about how abortion has corrupted pop culture and media. And now one of the things they note, which is interesting, is that the more creative the media source is, the less policy oriented and the more imagination oriented it is, the less permeated with pro-abortion ideology it seems to have been. And they actually note that Hollywood has been in no small trouble with the pro-choice movement over recent decades because Hollywood has been insufficiently preachy on behalf of abortion. And it's produced movies and TV shows that sort of give place to pro-life impulses. You could think of something like Juno, where ultimately she decides to have the baby. Or there was an episode of House. Do you remember House?
Oh, yeah.
He's a stereotypical unbeliever. I mean, he's just such a grouchy, sort of atheistic guy. But he mocks religion. But there's one episode where he's going to do like surgery on this fetus, this baby. And at one point during the surgery, he's sort of mocked the whole idea that it's a human. It's like, oh yeah, we got to fix the little person, instead of just aborting it and starting over. But then in the course of the surgery, the baby like reaches its hand out and grasps his finger. And he has this moment where he just sort of looks and is awed and silent. And then the episode ends, right? It's like the famous picture where the baby is kind of telling the doctor, "Thank you." It's like, that's the sentimental reading of what probably amounts to reflex, but it also reinforces the humanity of the baby. And so Hollywood has been not too thoroughly committed to pushing the pro-choice agenda. Now they've tried, but I think it comes down, ultimately the reticence there comes down to the fact that abortion really is ugly. It really is horrifying. And the more you show of it in reality, the less appealing it is. That's why the whole thing has had to be, the pro-choice movement has had to hide it behind euphemisms and clinical, cold, technical words like we talked about in the interview. And they can't show it for what it really is. And so there's something about abortion itself that's very difficult to beautify or to turn into propaganda.
Well, yeah, think about that. What is one of the main things that pro-choice, pro-abortion people insist on when they complain about pro-lifers? Free sonograms outside abortion clinics, because you can see the baby. And they talk about the number of people, the number of women who change their mind once seeing that is very high, remarkably high. And the other thing is they also don't want to see the other end of things. Admittedly, grotesque images of post-abortion. Babies have been killed. They know that it does not make for a good story because people see that. That makes a bit of an irony. It shows up in the book, the organizational takeover, the institutional takeovers, that you have these ostensibly scientific organizations that have been strongly pro-abortion. But when you talk about stories, the literary people, the movie people, who the stereotype is they're going to be far more progressive, they have a hard time telling beautiful stories about abortion because you just can't.
Yeah, I think if you want to try, the best you can do is to sort of glorify the freedom and opportunity that it supposedly allows women to follow their dreams, right? And that's the tack that has typically been taken. And then they'll try to sort of instead of beautify it, they'll sort of trivialize it. They'll try to make it funny. And again, the book actually talks about this and gives some examples that I had never watched. I hadn't seen them, but they try to make it into a joke, right? Going for my little quick abortion, and then I'm going to go off to college and so forth. That's a pathetic attempt. But as far as pushing back even further and beautifying life, I mean, there are so many answers to that. And I can think of examples of things that already sort of do this. We wrote a breakpoint a couple of years ago about the movie Peanut Butter Falcon, which starred Shia LaBeouf and Dakota Johnson, right? This young man with Down syndrome in the story, I mean, it's such a simple story. It's about, him getting together with Shia LaBeouf and running from his caregivers who want to keep him locked up in a nursing home with the old folks. And they have an adventure in the Pamlico Sound trying to get away from the stifling care and letting him, actually be a young man. But the message that's silently sort of portrayed is that life with a disability is beautiful, and people who have disabilities are beautiful. And the calculus that looks at a life and says the best we can do for this person is institutionalizing them, or by extension, especially with Down syndrome, to kill them before they come into the world. It exposes it for what it really is. And it's not because you look at them and you look at someone and you say, oh, look, their quality of life is not so bad after all. It's not on that level. It's on the level of, this is a person. This is a person with hopes. In this case, is to become a professional wrestler, but with the image of God shining from every pore, and that kind of beautification and humanizing. They actually refer to that. They quote someone in the book, and I'm trying to remember who, but the gist of it is that not doing eugenic abortions, in which we screen for disabilities and things like that prior to birth, and then abort the ones who fail the tests. Not doing that, and then investing in people who, don't meet our predetermined standards of what a functioning member of society should look like. Investing in those people and giving to them and sacrificing for them and loving them and welcoming them is the price we pay to remain human. I love that quote. And it really is a small price to pay, because there's nothing more expensive, nothing more damaging than losing your humanity. And that's exactly what you do when you degrade other people or try to look at them in that light. And I think just beautiful portrayals of humanity valued as such, instead of in a utilitarian way, can go so far toward changing the narrative. And this goes for, like, for instance, a baby who is handicapped not through any genetic disability or deformity or anything, but through circumstances. Like, this person is not convenient for me right now. This entirely healthy infant is not conducive to my career right now. Or the father has not lived up to his responsibility to come in and be a father and to help me raise this infant. Therefore, I'm going to kill them. To show a story where that terrible choice is not the only choice, just to show it and to beautify it, is a big deal. And that's what you sort of see play out in real life with pregnancy care centers and so forth.
But think about it. Think of the people that you see either in real life or in movies. The people who live for their careers, who live for their ambitions, who don't want to be caught down. Those are the villains in stories. Who are the people who live for other people? Those are the heroes. And we innately recognize. I mean, I think that line about that this is the price for keeping our humanity. The most inhumane people that we imagine and experience are those who live for themselves, absolutely for themselves. That not only does abortion deny the humanity of the unborn, or by extension, the mentally disabled or physically disabled, or even the impoverished. It denies their humanity, their worth. That takes our humanity away. We become less human by denying humanity to them. And I think that could be a really powerful way that, again, this is such a lockstep movement at the moment. That could be a really powerful way. It's like, be pro-life, be pro-human.
It's like what you said about the slave owners. It dehumanizes and degrades them. Did you see this quote, Tim? This was from Olivia Rondeau. It was a tweet. "My heart goes out to all the foster care kids kids who grew up in poverty and disabled kids who constantly have to hear that their existence is why unlimited abortions should exist. Your life has meaning and you were meant to be here. I mean, what an observation too. And something that most people have not thought of, that these folks that are used, these human individuals who are used as footballs in your political debates, they really exist, guys. And they're hearing this, they're seeing this, they're listening to these examples of, well, you wouldn't want a kid to grow up in foster care. My goodness, you wouldn't want a kid to grow up without both parents, or God forbid, to grow up with a disability of some kind. Well, those people are with us. They're right here next to us. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. They go to church with us, and they're hearing very clearly, your life is not worth living and you would be better off dead. Wow. I mean, what kind of message does that send?
It basically says that everyone's lives would be better off if you were dead. And that is an awful thing to say, that if you had not been born. Again, the classic stories that we have is people recognizing that their lives might not be perfect, but they have value because they are human beings, because of the relationship they have, because of what they can contribute to society. Maybe they might not contribute anything. And you think of the people, the mentally disabled or the infirm. Again, it is hard work, but that's being human. That's part of what it means to be here. We are in this fallen world, and the brokenness of sin and sickness and things like that are things we need to strive against. But we certainly become worse people. We all recognize we are worse people when we don't care for those people.
Yeah, you and I have a mutual friend and former colleague who has spent much of his adult life caring for his son who has autism. And the shift in priorities that you can discern in speaking with someone who's undergone this experience, who's given this kind of love and devoted his life in this way to a child, it challenges your preconceived notions of what success looks like in life. And I think that may be what they were getting at in the book when they said that this is the price of remaining human. It goes for all abortions, not just the sort of eugenic type abortions, but what does it mean to succeed in life? What does it mean to be a good person, to live a good life, to have contributed something, and to have made the world a better place? Does it mean that you made a certain salary and drove a certain car? Does it mean that you received these kind of academic credentials or recognition? Does it mean that you won a high office or started a company or something like that? Well, I mean, I'm not saying those things are bad, but if those are our only measures of success, to the exclusion of loving a family and building a community, or working within a church to bless people, or feeding those in need and recognizing their humanity in quiet and simple ways that don't earn you a lot of credit, or just, I think just loving someone selflessly is a meaningful life. But we don't recognize that. And to the extent that we've forgotten those things and reshaped our priorities around those things and said, oh my gosh, we must never allow ourselves to do those things, to be bound to that kind of life because it's inconvenient and it's demoralizing or whatever. We're not human in that way anymore. We're really something darker, something less. And that should scare us, and that should force us to rethink our priorities. And what does it say that we live in a society where we think we've had to kill over 60 million children in the last half century? What does that say about us? We don't have a place for them. That's a thought to ponder, maybe a jumping off point as well.
Yeah, I think that it's, again, if we were to see that kind of attitude in a movie, we'd clearly see them as the villains. And that might be a moment where our stories speak better than our slogans. The stories that we innately resonate with, that we connect to, recognize this, the goodness of giving yourself to another being over and against. We all see it. No one wants to see a story where Scrooge wins. You want to see a story where Scrooge recognizes, hey, I need to care about people. No one sees that and says, oh, that's good. Yes, there's those few who just, I will go for my self-ambition, but we usually don't like those people. They're not a lot of fun to be around.
Yeah. Did you see Man in the High Castle?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, so I'm not anywhere close to done with it, but I was on pause because we didn't have Amazon Prime for a while because we only have one streaming service at a time. But in there, the Nazis are in control of North America, and there's this kind of gut-wrenching character transformation that takes place when one of the main Nazi officers, who has been a brutal enforcer of all their eugenic policies, finds out that his beloved son, his teenage son, has this degenerative disease. It's sort of a Lou Gehrig's disease sort of thing. It's going to eventually lead to him losing all motion and then dying. And the upshot of it is that he's going to be a burden to society. And the Nazi regulations say that he has to be euthanized, right? And so this officer comes face to face with the reality of the doctrines that he has enforced and bought into for so long. And with the reality that one of his superior Aryan children might actually be caught in that meat grinder. And it really changes everything for him. It's a birth of moral insight and compassion for him. And that's just one like piece of entertainment that portrays things that way. And it makes me realize how hard it is to portray the abortion mindset in a positive light, and how easy it is to portray the critique of that mindset in any kind of media, even this sort of speculative historical fiction stuff.
Well, that is beautiful.
Well, we're out of time here. Tim, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. This was very good. I think there's a lot more that we could really unpack and go into with this conversation, but we will be talking more about, obviously, the abortion issue in the coming weeks and months on this program and then the other programs of the Colson Center. So thank you again, and I hope you'll be able to join me again in the coming weeks.
Sure. I look forward to doing that.